Hello everyone and welcome back. I am finally getting back to doing another pair of 18th century stays. I have made many of these over my many years in costuming. In fact, the last pair that I made was the very first video that I ever did for this channel. Those were 1690s stays, which are going to be pretty different from the 1780s stays that I'm getting to work on for this series. I have made 1780s stays before, but in all honesty, most of the ones that I made were done about 15 years ago. And not only are they very broken in from numerous years of wear and tear while I worked at Colonial Williamsburg and was wearing them for lots of labor and work and functions, but I've also changed body shape since then, so they no longer really effectively fit me, and I want to make a new pair for some upcoming events. Which means that I get to take all of you along on this journey because turns out stays are one of my favorite things to make, and I'm actually kind of sad that it has been this long since I have made a pair. They are incredibly complex and interesting and intricate garments because they need to be. They are adjusting the shape of the body without actually adjusting the body. Though most of us are more familiar with corsets than stays, the general timeline is that when you go back to the 15th century, the medieval period, they're wearing kirtles. There's not a ton of structure, but a tightly fitted garment will help with supporting the chest, supporting the back, all of those things. As we start separating out tops and bottoms, well, we start needing a bit more structure, the silhouette starts to change, they start adding in more layers into the bodice, get a stronger, more stiff conical shape. As we make it into the 17th century, they start separating out that garment, which by that point is being called bodies. And those early bodies range very widely in terms of how they are constructed and what the stiffening process is. It really starts to congeal, though, more towards the end of the 17th century into what we call stays. This is a very stiff, straight, conical structure that fits on the exterior of the body. We're not taking in the waist or really reducing anything. It does compress the bust to support it, much like a sports bra does today. At no point, though, should it be uncomfortable or restrictive in breathing in any way, shape, or form. It is snug around the waist, but it's there to support the skirts, hence why the tabs are on the bottom are necessary. The heavy skirts that fit over the waist should not hang directly off of your body. That will become incredibly painful and will bruise you. In addition to that, it offers back support and making sure that you have good posture. I have a lot of back problems, so stays actually do me a lot of good. If I have to stand or sit for a long period of time, it can actually help me not be in pain. So these are very comfortable, functional garments, and I've done a lot of hard physical labor in my stays over the years. But they change dramatically throughout their roughly 100-year time period that they exist. They come in at that end of the 17th century, and as we move through the 18th century, they become softer, a little bit more natural in shape, a little more curvy in certain areas. They become less structured. They eventually, as we reach the very end of the century, get shorter. So at that point, strap styles become really popular for everyday usage because it sort of helps keep that slightly above the actual waist in order to give that shortened appearance in the 1780s, 1790s. Not all styles are like that, but a good portion of them are. And eventually the curviness reaches the point where it can go no further, and they literally just start cutting cups into it and adding fabric back on in order to make its way into the corset of the 19th century with lots of curves and rounding. So there is not one style of stays that really goes over that 100-year span, but they are all somewhat conical in shape, and they have quite a few elements that are very similar. For one, the structure that you see that works throughout them, called boning, that will work in a particular pattern, which is pretty vertical in front, sometimes at a slight angle, and as we move our way around the sides, it tilts to a pretty severe angle to go from the lower front to the upper back. You don't want fully vertical bones underneath your arms. They will be stabbing you in both your armpits and in your hips. It is not a good idea. But as we move around towards the back, we need it vertical again for where there's often lacing. Sometimes a pair of stays is laced in the front or in the back, or in both places, hence why we can refer to it as a pair, because it is two halves, even if they are stitched together in front or in back. So you get complete choices over where you want your lacing, but the general concept of how they are designed is pretty similar. Most of them have 4 pieces per side. Some will have 5 or 6, some will have little slivers that end up extending portions because they needed things to be a little bit larger to change body shapes and sizes as the person changed. So you'll see plenty of examples that do not fit in this 4 pieces per side range, but that is probably the most common option. You have a very V-shaped front piece, then the side piece curves around the body. It's actually fairly straight, though it sits at a pretty extreme angle. In the back, we have what we colloquially call the Eiffel Tower piece, for obvious reasons. That is in order to flare out over the higher portion of your back where your hips are, and then the center back piece is a little straighter. Can still have some flare to it, though. And so that generally makes up the vast majority of stays. So you're going to see that same pattern repeated through a few different styles that I'm going to be working on today. Because for this video, I wanted to not only talk a little bit about the history of stays and some basic ideas of them, but I also want to show you the patterning process that I'm going to go through. The first fitting, deciding on all the supplies, and getting prepped for the actual work. The next video is going to be all about the construction of the stays and making those up. And then I eventually, hopefully very soon after, want to do a video on fitting stays. I'm not going to be spending a ton of time on that in this video because I already know the pattern's not going to be way off from what I need, and it's not going to be nearly comprehensive enough to show you all of the ways that there can be problems with fitting. This, interestingly enough, is a video that I have filmed before, which is one of the reasons why I really want to do this again, to be able to share with you, because the first time I filmed that video a little over 3 years ago, I did not have my own channel at that point, and the company that I made all of that footage for, making over 20 different mock-up styles in order to show what every single problem actually visually looks like on a body, well, they didn't use it immediately, and they have since sold the business, and it's no longer owned by people who'd be interested in that sort of stuff. So that means that that's never going to see the light of day, and I need to start over again. But that is a lot of work. It is necessary work, and I'm very excited to get to do it. It's just going to take a little bit of time, so bear with me on that. That is something that I am definitely working on at the moment, but for right now I'm going to cover the sort of patterning that I'm doing. Now, I ended up going through a ton of different options when I was trying to decide on my stays for this. I knew I wanted 1780s, I knew I wanted something similar to the previous pair that I did, but different enough that I would create some new challenges and answer some new questions. And the pair that I settled on was this one from the Bankfield Museum, which is part of the Halifax Museum. And all of the pictures that I was finding, as well as some descriptions and diagrams in a video, all come from the Handbound Costumes website, which they have extensive information on lots of different things that they've looked at over the years. They also do reproductions of 18th century garments. If you're in the UK, especially, and you're interested in that sort of thing, go check them out, but they have a lot of wonderful information on their site. So with that pair in mind and my old pattern in hand, I'm going to show you the process that I went through for adjusting that pattern to fit me and adjusting it for the style. I chose to go through this particular process of patterning because it made the most sense for what I had available to me. It is not the only way to do this, but you get to see both sizing something up as well as altering something to a different style. I know there are many other options out there, including pre-made patterns in different sizes, and lately the arc method has been particularly popular as well. I have found that that doesn't work for my body type at all. I'll show you a little bit more of that near the end of the patterning process, but we're going to tackle all of that, including a fitting, and then get into the supplies that I've started to collect. I'm beginning my process of patterning by taking the pattern that I have from about 15 years ago and sizing it up to my current measurements. Now, I have found that these days fit me better when they are a little bit smaller than my actual measurements, also accounting for about a 2-inch gap in the back. That's what I've found to be the most comfortable and most functional for me over the years. So I only need to add about 3 or so inches to the entire body of these stays in order to bring them up to where they need to be. I'm starting off by putting a 1/4 inch addition into the back. I'm also raising up the back. I will probably do this again, but this is where I want to start by just adding a 1/2 inch to make the back taller. I do know that I need a bit more flare over that back hip. That proportion has changed over the years, so I'm adding not only a little bit of a 1/4 inch in the Eiffel Tower piece, but I'm going to add a smidge to the back piece as well. I will go back in and redraw the same number of tabs, 3 for the Eiffel Tower and 4 for the angled side piece later. They'll just have to change proportions. I'm adding an inch to that side piece because that is really where I need the biggest change. Is not across the front necessarily or across the back, but just the total circumference change that will allow both the back and the front to make it a little closer to where they should be. So this seemed like the piece that made the most sense for me to change. I'm also adding a little bit to the front, about a 1/4 inch at the waist and a little over 1/2 inch at the top in order to accommodate the bust change. I am not moving where the strap is located, however, because that fits comfortably on me. The original pair that I made was a little bit broad across the bust until that part got larger on me, and then it fit correctly, so I know it is where it needs to be currently. I don't want to change that measurement. I'm then going through and double checking that I didn't accidentally grow or shrink some of the seam lengths, so that they still match up, and we'll make some tiny adjustments to the final version. Once I've done that, I can then go in and make all of the aesthetic differences. So there's an extension across the top of the back, sort of a tab there, and that will change up how the seams work at the top of that piece. I'm also taking in the upper portion of the Eiffel Tower piece and adding it to the side piece, because unlike the version that I have where the side piece is a bit of a trapezoid, I want it to be more of a parallelogram. So we're going for parallel edges on this, which means that I need to adjust the angles of those to make it right. The front V shape is also much more dramatic. It's very narrow in the front and very wide at the top. So I am adding some width to that top, but keeping it the same down at the bottom, keeping the tab in roughly the same place as well. There will be only a half lacing in the front of this that will be left open permanently. That's the way the original works. There's about a 1-inch gap at the very top. So though I do have to account for that in the mock-up and the placement of the straps, I won't actually have them in the final pattern. The mock-up is out of a stiffened canvas that I have, just quick straps pinned on, and I usually just have a few pieces of really heavy cardboard that fit into the stays temporarily in order to make sure that the front stays flat so I can see what the silhouette is. The overall fit is really good. It's very close to what I want, but I do feel like there's a little bit of finessing that I need. First off, dealing with the back. It is a bit too large overall. The back is lacing completely closed. I want about a 2-inch gap. Once I add the boning, this will grow in gap size, but it's still a little bit bigger than I want it to be. I'm definitely not going to add anything to these, that's for sure. I also know that I want the back to be higher, and that I need to deal with that crease that I'm seeing over the hips, which means I need a little bit more width down at that hip area, or I need to bring up the height more. I'd rather just open it up a little bit. The side seems to fit well, so I won't be making any major adjustments there aside from maybe taking it in order to adjust the overall size of the garment. The front also looks pretty good, but I do want to bring the length down a little bit in front. I'd rather have a longer front style. Nothing too dramatic, just maybe an inch or so, which should help with the overall silhouette. However, where the straps sit, where the front sits in terms of the neckline is really good. I am finding overall it's a little bit too big in the waist. The bust is about where it should be, sans whatever needs to happen in the back, but the waist is definitely too large and I could adjust that shape in a little bit. So I will be making adjustments to a few of the pieces in order to get closer to what I'm looking for, but it's not going to be a dramatic shift. The only major changes to the back are, first off, the length. I added about an inch up at the top, so that way it would fit the back better. I also flared out the bottom just a little bit around where the tab is. Interestingly enough, I noticed that this is the way the original was done, and it works perfectly for my body shape. Once I started laying in all of the complex boning patterns, that's where I started to notice the slight differences in the shapes that I had versus the original. I was able to make some slight accommodations, which actually ended up working better for my body. But the boning channels here are running in kind of a weird V shape, so I think it's going to be really interesting once we can visualize that on the finished piece and see how it actually interacts with the body, rather than just using all vertical bones. For the Eiffel Tower piece, there's not a dramatic difference, though I changed the overall height of the back. There's not a huge difference in the height of this piece because I actually brought it up in back just slightly as well. I also flared out at the bottom the same amount, but brought in the width at the top, so that way it does shrink the overall size of the stays just a little bit, but does not shrink it over that high hip portion that I'm having trouble with. For the side piece, this is where the vast majority of the reduction happened. You can see about 1/2 inch taken off of the side there. I also adjusted it so that way it's a little higher towards the back and a little lower towards the front, accommodating both the high back and the low front that I want. And the only other thing I had to do here was sort of curve out at the bottom. It's a very straight line and then it swoops towards the back. And this was something that I discovered when I started working on the boning patterns and trying to figure out how those angles need to line up. It had to happen. For the front, I lengthened it slightly, widened the little section down at the bottom so it's a little bit more coverage. I kept the top portion exactly the same until we get over to the edge, where I added a little bit to the bust for that piece there. I didn't add any to the waist, so that way that's still the same and will not be adding to my problem of this being slightly too big. I also took off the V in the very front. That will be added in by a separate piece later. The boning channels on this were definitely interesting, and this is the part that I am the most excited about. They radiate out from the center front, and I can't wait to see how this works in curviness on the body. As for the overall difference you can see between the original pattern and this pattern, I'm not sure I would have known where to start to try and make that change, so going through a couple of steps in between definitely helped get me to a pattern that I'm hoping is much closer to the original pair that I'm working off of, but will work well for my body. This is also where I want to talk about the curves of my body. Every single person's going to be different, so while you can line these up and see a general arc, if I draw a not even symmetrical arc, but a proportionally symmetrical arc with there's 3/5 towards the front and 2/5 towards the back, I'm still ending up with a dramatically different arc. This is my original pair that I know fits me very well, and I used the measurements that were taken to make that pair of stays and made up the arc as I have found instructions for, but the arc of my actual waist does this, where you can see it tips way down in front and way up in back. It just doesn't work on my body as easily. I could change that, but honestly, you can make up stays in whatever way works for your brain, and then you can check the arc system. So you can see here, I still have a good arc. If I actually line up all of these bottom pieces at the angles they'll be, it's pretty straight across, which I thought was really cool. But that gives me a good shape for my body, which isn't very symmetrical. Next up, it comes to the supplies. There are a lot of things I have to decide on. The first thing I did decide on was that I'm using 4mm bones for most of this. I do have some places for 6mm boning. I am using German plastic whalebone, which I highly recommend. I've used in so many different corsets and stays over the years. It is the closest thing to whale baleen, or colloquially whalebone, which is not bone at all, but is actually made out of the same stuff that our fingernails and hair is made out of. So it's meant to be very flexible and adjustable. It's not brittle. It's going to hold its shape once you apply heat and moisture. So using something similar, especially when I'm putting this much boning in, is really important. As for the materials themselves, generally stays are made up of 2 layers of linen buckram and possibly an outer layer of a different fabric and a lining as well. So the most important thing for me to make sure that I have correct is the linen buckram on the inside. This is what's providing the stability of the pattern, so that way as I'm working it's not shifting back and forth and it's not changing as I'm stitching all of these channels. So I'm starting off with a mid-weight denser weave linen canvas. This is something that I got from Burnley and Trowbridge recently, and I am adding gum tragacanth to it. So what you can see here is I have gotten a powdered form of gum tragacanth. You can get it already in liquid form, both are fine, and I get it to the point where it's kind of a little gloopy but not at all thick. And then I'm brushing it on using a brush that I used to use for wallpaper, but it's kind of chewed up at this point. You can just get a really cheap paintbrush for this, and you'll need a lot more than I showed you there for a single yard of fabric. I think I made about 3 times as much of that as I showed in order to get through 1 yard of fabric for a pretty dense layer. What you can do is do a much thinner version as well, wet it all down, and then repeat the process multiple times. I'm just short on time right now, so I wanted it all done at once, and I wanted to saturate this thing through and through. It will take a little bit longer to dry this way, but I also currently live in the desert and it's about 100 degrees every day, so I'm not too worried about this thing drying. I set up a frame outside with some curtain clips, hung it up to dry, and it only took about 20 minutes in the afternoon sun at 100 degrees before it was crispy. And that's what we're going for. Not something that is stiff as a board for this, but something that isn't going to shift on the bias diagonal really easily. I want, once I cut this pattern and draw the lines, for it to stay in that position. To be honest, once the boning goes into it, it won't really matter as much, but we'll have the shape formalized and finished by then. For the face fabric, I'm still going back and forth on a few things. I have a couple different wools and wool silk mixes. I think I'm going to go with a lighter tone, however. I don't like doing that because you don't get to see the boning channels nearly as clearly, but it is much more practical in terms of wearing it under lighter weight or light colored garments. For the binding, I am going to use leather for this, and so I'm going to be using a very lightweight white leather for this. I haven't decided which one out of my collection, if I'm going to find something better. I'll talk more about this in the next video, but you don't have to use leather. They use a lot of linen tapes and other types of things as well. I just like leather because it's something I have and it lasts for a really long time and is easy to work with for my experience. You'll also commonly find a tape running down the seams to cover those up. This is a little bit more difficult to figure out because this is actually something that was specially woven in the time period and they just don't make anymore. So I have a silk tape coming from Japan, which is a similar width and will do well enough for this. Same thing goes with the cord for the stay lacing up the back. I usually just use a linen tape for that, and eventually it wears out and you get a new one. It's not a big deal, it's not expensive. I do want a fancier one for some things though, like photo sessions, so I got a heavier weight silk cord, which is pretty similar to what survives on a few extants from Japan that I've wanted to try for a stay cord for a while. I just haven't made stays since I got that, so we're going to try that out. And the final part to this whole thing is the thread. I am choosing to go with a 30 weight silk for this. You can also use linen thread. I just wanted to try out a silk thread because I find it easier to stitch with. I have a lot of boning channels to do and I didn't want to keep waxing thread over and over and over again. So I'm going to be using that for the vast majority of my stitching. And that makes up most of what I need for this project. There might be some other odd layers on the interior, but I'll get to the odd bits when I get to the construction video. I feel very Hamilton.